About a year ago, here on Bipolar Waking Up, I set a goal for myself, and that goal was to put together the entire puzzle of bipolar disorder one video at a time. And as I've done over 10 theory videos on bipolar disorder, I thought it might be a good time to take a look at each of those pieces that I've created and start to put them together so that you can see the bigger picture. And as I talk about one video after another, I've provided links so that if you want to get into more details and see one video in particular, you can do so. Now, while I have made one video on depression so far, my focus really has been on the mania side, particularly the acute psychosis or period of insanity that can happen to people when they're in a state of mania. Now, as many of you are aware, these states of acute psychosis are considered incurable by psychiatry and will require a lifetime of medication. However, it's my opinion that these episodes are deeply misunderstood by psychiatry and that they in fact can be healed. In fact, I've healed from one myself, and that's what my story, Am I Bipolar or Waking Up, was all about. Then, after realizing that so many of you had had experiences so similar to my own, I thought I would share the theories of transpersonal psychologists, especially Dr. Stan Grof and Dr. John Weir Perry. Both of these doctors had spent a lifetime healing mental illness, not medicating it. So with my first theory video, I thought I'd tackle how these acute psychoses start in the first place. And as opposed to psychiatry, which tells you that you've got a chemical imbalance and that was the cause, I put forward the idea that I've learned from these doctors and has reflected my own experience, which is that an acute psychosis starts with a collapse of the ego. So in the video, The Real Cause of Bipolar Disorder, I start out by explaining what exactly an ego is, and it's quite different than most mainstream psychiatrists and psychologists lead you to believe. And so it's here that I'd introduce the idea that the ego is the false self. It's who you think you are, but you're not. And the analogy I give is that it's as if you're a baby chick that thinks you are the eggshell. You're not the eggshell. The eggshell is there to protect you and help you grow, but at some point the eggshell becomes limiting and you need to break out of it. Now, once into an acute psychosis, the experience can be quite fearful and disturbing for the person. However, what's rarely talked about among psychiatry or psychologists is that there are many experiences that are deeply spiritual. So in the video, Is Bipolar Mania Spiritual Enlightenment?, I start to compare the experience of being in psychosis with the experience that many Buddhist monks have of actually achieving enlightenment. And as you'll see, there are many parallels, including feelings of timelessness and a oneness or connection with the universe, a feeling of being tested by God or even being God. All of this can be present in a psychosis, and this can be present in experiences of enlightenment as well. And then in part 2 of Is Bipolar Mania Spiritual Enlightenment, I go on to explain how the complex inner feelings and thoughts that we have while in psychosis, as sacred as they can be sometimes, often motivate us to act very strangely. And because we behave so strangely and often are very uncooperative, the people around us, especially our families, the parents, and police, don't treat us with the love and compassion that we need to get through this process. Rather, they treat us like problems that need to be solved and silenced. Then, in the video, Why We're Bipolar, Normal Life Sucks, I start to take a deeper look at the underlying causes of bipolar disorder, such as the emotional issues that surface during the psychosis. And what we find initially is that while the psychosis does start with a collapse of the ego, it does so because your psyche is attempting to resolve a tension that exists between who you really are, your soul or true self, and who you think you need to be in order to survive in this world, your false self or ego. Because of this inner tension, many bipolar people have this feeling that they don't really have bipolar disorder, but that they have I can't be me disorder. So in order to resolve this tension between the soul and the ego, the first thing that has to happen is that we need to start allowing our periods of acute psychosis to play themselves out in safe environments. Unfortunately, as we all know in our society today, we're not allowed to enter into these periods of psychosis because we see no value in them. In fact, according to psychiatry, being in psychosis can actually cause brain damage, and they say this without having any scientific proof of that whatsoever. So, in the video How to Heal Bipolar Mania, I discuss the value of such experiences and how they can lead to spiritual breakthroughs for people that make it through the experiences successfully. Then, starting in 2009, I began to outline in detail the exact experiences which in fact do heal if someone is allowed to enter into the psychotic process in a supportive environment. In Traumas, Repressions, and the Healing of Bipolar Disorder, I outline how various traumas and repressed feelings from adulthood, childhood, and even our birth process are relived and healed during psychosis. I also discuss very otherworldly experiences such as feeling connected to the cosmos and sensations from other cultures, times, and places, which also have strong emotionally healing significance. In Family Secrets and the Healing of Bipolar Disorder, I talk about how the untold truths of our lives and our family relationships are part of the underlying problems that cause our disorder. Of particular focus is the cold, hard parenting that many of us grow up with, and this style of parenting leaves us with the feeling of having an inner void that we seek to fulfill within our daily life. Then, in Aggression, Suicide, and the Healing of Bipolar Disorder, I talk about how these often violent and destructive feelings can come up in a manic episode as well, especially when they're connected to the traumas and repressions and family secrets I've already talked about. However, after doing extensive online research with bipolar people, I believe that much like the other traumas, repressions, etc., the feelings of anger and the violent feelings need to be worked through in psychosis as well, and that in fact these feelings usually become much worse once a person's in contact with psychiatry. And as you'll see when you watch the video, that it certainly seems like the psychiatric approach to labeling people mentally ill and medicating them for life appears to be causing more suicides than it's preventing. Now, if everything I've said up to now is true, why is it that so few people have this understanding of bipolar disorder? Well, the answer to that is we are still evolving. In part 1 of my series on bipolar disorder and consciousness, I introduced the idea that from the beginning of history we have been gradually evolving through different levels of consciousness laid out in a theory called spiral dynamics. And in part 1 of the series I introduced the theory describing each level of consciousness one at a time. Then in part 2 of the series I provide some specific examples of different people at different levels of consciousness, and then I'm able to make a comparison between the people at a higher level of consciousness who are able to heal their bipolar disorder as compared to those at lower levels that usually fall victim to the psychiatric system, which is at the lower modern level of consciousness. And the key point I make in the video is that according to psychiatry and our modern level of consciousness, the only things that are real are what can be measured. And as a result, when they look for the source of a problem or a disorder, they need to look at the human being as an entirely biological organism. Now, mainstream psychiatry continues to hang on to this materialist belief system despite a number of problems with their theory, and the biggest problem of which is that some people heal from their disorder. And many of these people not only heal, but they consider it a breakthrough in their lives and are grateful for the experience. And for those who do heal, the message they send back for the rest of us is very clear. This acute psychosis is a spiritual experience. And so in order to have a true breakthrough while you're in psychosis, you need to approach the psychosis as a spiritually healing process which requires a higher level of consciousness. And what's even more exciting here is that people who are not really psychologically prepared to go through this process alone can have breakthroughs if they're properly supported. And to support an episode properly, you need to follow the advice of Power of Now author Eckhart Tolle and simply be in the present moment. And in part 3 of my series on bipolar disorder and consciousness, that's where I talk about how you support somebody by simply being with them as opposed to doing something to them when they're in an acute psychosis. Now, I think it's pretty obvious that so far I've put together a pretty big part of this puzzle, but I'm not done yet. So what I want to do is tell you what I've got in store for future videos. Well, first, in a sense, I feel like I haven't even told you half the story. I still need to talk about the meaning and causes of delusions, hallucinations, and those ever-present synchronicities that so many of us seem to experience while we're in psychosis. I need to do a real good job on the subject of paranoia because it's such an important subject and can really get in the way of the healing, so I'll be asking my friends at New Light Beings to help me out with that one. I want to show you guys a model I've come up with, which I think does a good job of describing the difference between spiritual emergencies, bipolar disorder, and schizophrenia. I haven't even mentioned what I feel is behind this huge surge in bipolar disorder cases, especially among the young. And perhaps most importantly, I haven't said a word about what I know many of my subscribers are already feeling, that this surge in bipolar disorder is a part of our global spiritual evolution, and that those of you who are suffering at the hands of psychiatry today could be the pioneers of a whole new culture, a whole new society, a whole new way of being for all of us. But before I can even start to discuss any of those topics, we need to take a step back. Right back to the very beginning. At the end of my last video, Solving the Bipolar Disorder Puzzle, I touched on the idea that bipolar disorder is actually part of a bigger evolutionary movement happening among mankind, and that to understand this idea, we really need to go back to the very beginning. But after thinking about it, I realized that we need to go back even further. A little further. Further. No, that's too far back. Okay, that's better. Okay, I don't know about you, but I love coral reefs. And one of the things I love about them is that somehow there's sort of a cross between a plant and an animal. And yet, while it looks like a plant, as you swim by, often its active instinctive consciousness is unmistakable. And the reason is that if you get too close, the whole coral will recoil in fear. And in this way, coral reefs, humans, and every life form in between have one thing in common. When we sense danger, we shut down. We'll do whatever is necessary to protect ourselves from what's threatening us. Now, in the animal kingdom, that behavior could be related to the fight or flight mechanism, where the animal will either run away or attack. However, for us so-called humans, our normal behavior usually doesn't involve attacking. Rather, most of the time we just start to act like an asshole when we feel threatened. When threatened, we'll usually try and manipulate or intimidate people we think we can control that are threatening us. Or we might play nice and friendly to their face, only to screw them behind their back. And sometimes, like the reef, we'll just shut down and act like everything's okay when it's clearly not okay. And then after that, we'll usually follow it up with some nice passive-aggressive behavior, which used to be my specialty. Now, on the other hand, when we feel safe and protected, we open ourselves to life and can feed ourselves. But unlike the coral, which is basically looking to feed itself with just food, humans are looking to feed themselves with food as well as a variety of other things as well. Things like our relationships with family and friends, our creativity, our curiosity, and our passion. And when these things get fed, life becomes enjoyable, spontaneous, and even carefree. And when we are open like this, we are in a state of love. And this love can manifest itself into many forms. Into peace and happiness, into laughter, and perhaps most importantly, into compassion for others. Not only our own family, but our neighbors, people of other races, cultures and belief systems, even other life forms, including that coral reef. And in our love, we feel connected and alive. And to feel alive is truly living in the present moment. So by now, I hope you've figured out that love and fear are not just things that we do, but are entire states of being. And in a state of love, we're relaxed, whereas in a state of fear, we're tense. The state of love is an attracting force. The state of fear is a separating force. And where love is freeing, fear is controlling. And where love is accepting, fear is judgmental. And as a result, love is a healing process, whereas fear is hurtful. And this healing is integrating and cooperative, whereas the fear is destructive and competitive. Needless to say, love comes from the spiritual and fear purely the physical. And like I said, love is open and fear is closed. And when you look at it this way, it seems like such a simple choice. Choose love, not fear. Simple. But the truth is that choosing love over fear is hardly that easy. And that most people today are living lives which are much more fear-driven than they even realize. And the reason for this is that the amount of time during our daily lives that we spend in a state of fear and that we spend in a state of love is directly related to our level of consciousness. Because as we're evolving, we're moving from more fearful, closed states, which deal with a more narrow reality, to more open, loving states, which deal with a much broader reality. Let me give you a more concrete example. Imagine this boring gray circle represents all of reality, all of the infinite possibilities of our world today. But you're living at the tribal or magical level of consciousness that I've already described in my videos on bipolar disorder and consciousness. Now, during your daily life, when you're having experiences which fit into the everyday routine of your own culture, you're going to accept them and you're not going to have a problem with that. However, almost all experiences or encounters that happen outside of your everyday tribal reality will be rejected. And the reason is that your ego filters out the unaccepted reality. So in this sense, whatever is within the ego, we are open to and receptive in a state of love. And whatever is outside the borders of our reality, outside the ego, we are closed to and respond to with a state of fear. Now, fortunately for us modern people, we pass through this tribal level of consciousness quite quickly at a fairly young age. Speaking personally, I was through the tribal level probably around the age of 3 or 4, then on to the feudal level where I stayed until about 8 or 9 years old, then into the conformist traditional level, which held my attention probably until about the age of 16 or 17. Then I stayed in the modern level probably right through university and into my early working years at like 26, 27 years old. My first taste of the multiple perspective postmodern level came very specifically when I was 27 years old and moved to Vancouver. I can remember it distinctly. And then the importance of the present moment really struck home when I went into my psychosis at age 30, but I never really started living like that until a few years later, and that period sort of went from 33 up until now. And at every step along this journey, something very interesting has been happening. Because once we've become comfortable with one level of consciousness, we start to address our fears and let in the experiences of the next level above. And in this process, the defensive, closed ego dissolves, but only one layer at a time. And as a layer of ego dies, it allows your true self or soul to experience a broader reality and to express itself in that reality in a more authentic, honest way. Now, in real life, an ego death can have you asking questions about yourself like, who am I? What is the real world? Who do I care about? And where do I fit into all this? It can be a period that can be quite confusing for people sometimes. But it can also be very energizing, because when you have a leap in consciousness in your life, you start to see the world in a completely fresh way, and things start to look new and interesting and exciting all over again. And they should, because you've opened yourself up to a whole new level of reality. And with that, you've overcome a tremendous number of fears along the way. Just to give one example from each level of consciousness, we need to remember that when you're at the tribal level, the whole point of living is to honor the spirits and the ancestors. So to move forward to the feudal level, you've got to break through your fear of these spirits and ancestors and fear that they may even kill you. At the feudal level, a big part of living is to demand respect. So to actually conform to a culture and obey their rules means that you need to start trusting people that otherwise you used to be afraid of. Now, at the traditional level of consciousness, the main thing is to obey the rules and conform to society. So when you start to go against society, there can be a big fear of being punished, especially by God. Now, at the modern level, everything is about achieving success. So when you actually leave that level, the biggest fear you have is a fear of failure. Now, at the postmodern level, everything is about creating harmony and understanding, especially through considering other perspectives and listening to people. So to actually take a stand or have an opinion that you're going to come out and say is better than that of others, well, there you've got to face a big social disapproval, which is what I face every time I talk about spiral dynamics. And then at the Power of Now level, you have a deeper understanding of the importance of keeping your attention in the present moment and a knowledge that if you can do that, that your life is open to love and free of fear. So by now, I think it's safe to say that the journey of life can be a very difficult one where we have many fears to face as we grow and develop our level of consciousness and many ego deaths to go through in our lifetime. In fact, I'd describe this journey as positively heroic. And that's exactly how Joseph Campbell described it in his book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces. Because the journey of life for everyone is one in which we need to face our fears and open ourselves up to love. Now, what does all of this have to do with bipolar disorder? Well, to start with, bipolar disorder is a process which is basically putting your spiritual evolution into overdrive. Because especially once you go into an acute psychosis, it's the opportunity for you to completely express the love that is in your heart, to speak your truth, and to face and embrace the fears that are within you. And if you can do that, then a spiritual evolutionary leap in consciousness is not that far away. In part one of this series on the spiritual evolution of bipolar disorder, I demonstrated how, as a society and as individuals, we are spiritually evolving from lower levels of consciousness to higher levels through a gradual stage-like dissolving of the layers of our ego, or false self. And through this process, as our egos die one layer at a time, our souls are able to experience more of the real world and express themselves in a more authentic way, moving gradually from a more fearful, closed state to a more open, loving state. And now in this video, I want to provide a little bit more hard evidence of how this evolution is happening. And as you'll see, the evolution of our consciousness has a lot to do with the perspective, or should I say perspectives, from which we can see the world around us. Let me show you what I'm talking about. Now I'm going to deal with the tribal level of consciousness a little bit later because it's a very complex subject. However, at the feudal level of consciousness, we still only have one perspective on life, and that is our own. And at this level, who we are is clearly our body, and basically our five senses are telling us what's the real world around us. And because this level is largely unfiltered by the mind, our response to this world is quite impulsive and selfish. And the reason is, at this level, we're simply incapable of taking in the perspectives of other people and considering those in our decision-making process. Basically, whatever we want, that's it. That's the reality. Now, if you're 4 or 5 years old at the feudal level of consciousness, maybe people might think of you as a little bossy, but it's expected for your age and can even be kind of cute. But if you're still at this level going into your 20s, you've got a lot of problems. Your selfish and impulsive desires to do whatever you want without consideration for others could have you ending up in jail or dealing drugs or involved with some other criminal element. Now, unfortunately, in our world today, there still are cultures that are like this in different parts of the world, and a good example is the slums of Rio de Janeiro, which are basically controlled entirely by drug dealers. The local police are very corrupt, and many of the women are involved in prostitution. And in fact, anywhere in the world where you have very high levels of unemployment, extreme poverty, very low levels of education, in this sort of environment, you're going to have a lot of people at the feudal level of consciousness. When we move to the traditional level, we go from having only one perspective on life, which is our own, to taking on a second perspective, the perspective of the culture we're living in. And with this second perspective, we start to see the world in terms of good and bad, or even good and evil. And what we learn in this duality is that basically what our parents, schools, and religions expect from us, that's considered the good, and we try and conform to that. And as for ourselves, we look at our own impulsive nature and see that as the evil or bad thing. And so, for better or for worse, we'll start to repress our inner nature in order to gain love and social approval. So needless to say, there's a fair amount of repression that happens at this level, but it's not all bad. These days, repression gets a bad rap, but when you're moving from the feudal level of consciousness, the repression of your selfish ways is a needed thing. And throughout history, it's been religion that's helped people find the straight and narrow for the most part. Because people at the feudal level usually can't do it on their own. They need strong leadership and structure to help them become better people. Now, traditional culture is pretty easy to find in America today. Just go to any small town, particularly in the Bible Belt, and you're going to find a way of life that really reflects this two-perspective way of thinking. At the modern level of consciousness, we take on a third perspective, and that perspective is of the rational mind.
At this point, we're no longer satisfied just obeying certain rules because they're written down in a book. We want to start actually looking at the facts of a situation. So for many people entering the modern level of consciousness, they find their religion quite difficult to deal with. For example, they might start to question creation stories like the world starting with Adam and Eve. Or they might have even deeper rational questions like, if they're going to heaven because they're Christians, what does that say about the billions of people in the world that are not Christian? And then there's the biggest question of all, does God even exist? And for the modern mind, if you're going to argue the existence of God, you better have your facts straight. And then along with all the rational questions that religions are unable to answer, there's also the problem of the conformity as well. For many modern people, strong rituals like needing to pray every day or even 5 times a day, having to be at church every Sunday or Saturday, or even things like no sex before marriage can just seem too restrictive and too conformist for their liking. And as a result, it's not uncommon for many modern people to walk away from the religions or even become atheists or agnostics. And I think the best example of a modern level of consciousness can be seen in New York City, where people are not praying to God for success, but actually getting out and working their butts off to get it. Now, once you move through the modern mind, something remarkable happens, because basically what you start to see is that no matter how hard you work, no matter how successful you become, there's still a certain emptiness inside of you. Because you see, all along this journey of life, you're being told that your happiness, your satisfaction is just up ahead, and yet it never quite arrives. And it's at this point that many people start to ask themselves, what is the meaning of my life? What is the purpose of my life? And why am I here? And so while the rational mind does get rid of the irrational beliefs of the lower levels of consciousness, it also starts to come to the logical conclusion that rationally, life is completely meaningless. And there's something about that answer that simply just doesn't compute. And so in growing exhausted of the cold rationality of the modern mind, a person awakens to the multiple perspective view of the postmodern mind, especially because until now you've had the assumption that there is a certain fixed reality out there that you're responding to. But all of a sudden now you're even starting to question the nature of reality and the nature of who you are as a human being. For the postmodern level of consciousness, there is no one truth out there like the rational mind believes or the religious mind believes or even the impulsive feudal mind believes, that there are many truths for many different people, and it's impossible for any one person to say who's right and who owns the entire truth. Now, with this passion for diversity from a spiritual standpoint, it's at the postmodern level that people really start to explore different ways of approaching spirituality and religion. And as a result, there's a lot of what has been referred to as the New Age movement in this postmodern level of consciousness. And that movement has taken a lot of criticism because it seems to encompass all kinds of different belief systems. But that's what to be expected at the postmodern level, because the postmodern level is so open, it really doesn't discriminate at all against one style of thinking or another, provided that that style of thinking is not exclusive. And that's why in the 1990s you really saw a surge in interest in things like Eastern spirituality, Hinduism and Buddhism. You saw a boom in tarot cards and tarot card readings, psychics of all kinds, as well as an explosion in self-help books and spiritual books like the Celestine Prophecy, which was #1 on the New York Times list for an entire year. And of course, let's not forget the quantum physics, which had everybody asking themselves, what the fuck do we know? And maybe that should be the mantra for the postmodern level of consciousness, because at this level, your focus is on taking in different perspectives and trying to come to a mutual understanding. And as a result, sometimes it's a quite confusing level to be at, and especially in the world of work, it can take a very long time to make a set decision, because who am I to say if my opinion is better than yours? Now, as you go through the postmodern level of consciousness, you start to realize a few blind spots to this level. The first being that this level is very complicated because you're always looking at different perspectives. And out of this, you start to realize that you need to develop something within you to help you decide amongst different opinions which is the best way to go. And that thing you need to develop, we call our intuition. Now keep in mind, this doesn't mean closing your eyes to alternate perspectives. It just means being able to intuitively choose which is the better perspective to go with depending on the situation. It also means learning to trust your feelings, because the intuitive voice is not coming from the mind. It's coming from your soul. And you can only hear the voice of your soul when you're in the present moment. Now, if you haven't figured it out by now, being in the present moment means being in an open state, a state of love. Anytime we're in a state of love, we're in the present moment. Anytime we're in the present moment, we're in a state of love. And so in truth, at every level of consciousness, there's been moments where we have been at the power of now level, at this higher state of awareness. The trouble is, we just never realized it. That's because the other levels of consciousness had a different underlying focus, which was staying alive. But here the focus shifts from staying alive to being alive. And that makes all the difference. Now, before I get to any conclusions on the spiritual evolution of bipolar disorder, we need to take a look at the tribal level of consciousness, and in particular, the role of shamanism. Because as you'll see, if you want to understand the bipolar mind, first you need to understand the shamanic mind. In the last 100 years, we've really come a long way with regards to our cultural understanding of people different from ourselves, especially with respect to tribal people. In fact, even that term, tribal people, would have been quite unheard of back then. Instead, they would have referred to them just as savages. And far from considering them equal as human beings, civilized society, or so-called civilized society, used to look at them almost like animals. Take Ota Benga, for example. He was an African pygmy who was purchased in Africa to come and be part of an exhibit at the St. Louis World's Fair around the turn of the century. And once the World's Fair was over, he went on to live among the animals at the Bronx Zoo, for a while living in one of the cages. And at the World's Fairs, it wasn't just Africans on display, but tribal people from around the world, including Native American Indians. So needless to say, we've come a long way since 100 years ago, and I think we can largely thank technology, especially television, for that. TV shows from the 50s like The Lone Ranger showed that Indians and cowboys can even be friends, provided the Indians have a decent haircut. And then in the 1990s, race relations took a more intimate turn with movies like Dances with Wolves, where Kevin Costner, playing an American soldier, actually starts to learn from the Indians, learning their ways instead of trying to teach them the more modern ways of the white man. And in my opinion, it was movies like Dances with Wolves that really touched people that were moving into the postmodern level of consciousness. Because it certainly seemed that tribal peoples around the world knew something about living on this planet that modern man had clearly forgotten. Tribal living seemed to create a community that really cared about each other and was there for each other, as opposed to the modern workaholic lifestyle, which has very little time for family and even less for community. Tribal living had a deep respect for nature and featured almost no environmental damage, especially when compared to modern society. And then maybe most importantly, as opposed to living in an apparently meaningless world where the whole point of living is just to buy more stuff, the tribal society had an intimate relationship with spirit, which was represented best by the tribal shaman. And as a result, small shamanic groups started popping up all over the world, and in fact I belong to one down here in São Paulo, Brazil. Once every couple of months, my wife and I participate in a sweat lodge down here, and then once or twice a year we participate in the Indian dances as well. And these dances aren't easy. The sun-moon dance involves dancing on and off for 3 days without food or water. So, obviously, tribal shamanism plays a pretty important role in my life and my spirituality. However, I still agree with Ken Wilber and the theory of spiral dynamics that the tribal level of consciousness is at the bottom, or should I say the beginning, of the development of our consciousness on this planet. And not only does tribal consciousness represent the very beginning of our development as humans, but it also shares many similarities with the beginning of our own individual consciousness when we're small children. And because of this connection to our own personal childhoods, I wanted to take a very close look at tribal consciousness to show you how far you've evolved in your own life. Okay, so now before I really get into it, let me just clarify that when I'm talking about tribal peoples at the tribal level of consciousness, I'm talking about tribes that have had very limited contact with other cultures, if any. They have no written language, they have no technology, and for the most part they're living in the same way they have for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And when we get a good look at people living on the planet today like that, what we see are people living in a very closed and very fearful state of mind. A way of thinking that often has brutal consequences. Let me give you a few examples. Infanticide, or the killing of children, especially babies, has been very common for thousands of years in tribes around the world, particularly when the babies have a birth defect, and to a certain degree that makes rational sense, because it's very difficult for a tribe to maintain a disabled person within the tribe. However, what few people understand is that many children are also killed because it's thought by other people in the tribe that they're possessed by a demon or a bad spirit. You can see how this is done in the video Hakani, which admittedly was made by Christian missionaries, and what the video shows is that when it's thought that a child is possessed by a bad spirit, they will kill the child by burying them alive. And the reason the child is buried alive is because it's believed that the child needs to be killed with his last breath taken under the ground, or else the spirit of the child will come back and haunt the tribe. Another horrific practice is that of female circumcision. In many tribes across North Africa, it's commonly practiced that young girls, as they become women, will have their clitoris cut off. And as explained by a tribal elder in a YouTube video that I have linked here, if they do not perform the female circumcision, the entire tribe will die because they will have disrespected the spirits. Sometimes it's easy to forget that cannibalism was once practiced by many tribes all around the world. The practice was so common in the Fijian Islands that they used to be referred to as the Cannibal Islands. Now, I'm sure that most of you think that thankfully cannibalism has been wiped off the planet Earth. However, in some small tribes in the mountains of New Guinea, occasionally they still eat each other. And when does the tribe eat somebody? When that person has been accused of practicing witchcraft. Now, I chose these three examples to demonstrate a couple of things. First, the tribal level of consciousness can be extremely violent, but even more importantly for our discussion on consciousness, there is a great fear that these people have of evil spirits, a fear so great that tribal people around the world will even kill and mutilate people in their own tribe to keep those evil spirits away. So then the big question is, why are tribal people so concerned with evil spirits? Well, the reason is they see the world in a completely different way than does the modern mind. Because for most of us, we just take it for granted that we're living in two worlds essentially at the same time. We have our inner world of our mind, where our thoughts, feelings, dreams, fantasies, and memories are. And then we have the outer world that we detect with our five senses, where we recognize people, places, and things. However, what few of us realize is that when we're born, our perception is not like this at all. For the small child and for the primitive tribal person, there is only one world. And what I mean is they don't recognize a difference between their inner world and their outer world. The inner and outer are one. However, this fusion is hardly the cosmic oneness of enlightenment, far from it. Unable to distinguish the thoughts of the imagination from the real world, the small child or the tribal person will engage in entirely irrational, magical thinking. And as a result, their fantasies, but also their fears, become as real as anything happening in the outside world. And this is where the danger lies, because magical thinking brings your fears to life. And a great example of this in daily life is the childhood fear of the dark. And of course, for the tribe, the example of the fearful magical thinking is what we've just talked about, this preoccupation with evil spirits and witchcraft. Now, along with possessing the magical thinking that our children have today, the tribal level of consciousness also thinks in very concrete or literal ways. So in the same way that many children believe that Santa Claus is alive and well and living at the North Pole, the original tribal Hopi Indians believed that the spirits of their Kachina dolls lived on the San Francisco peaks near their tribal land in Arizona. Tribal creation stories, very similar to the ones like the story of Adam and Eve, are always taken as historical fact, never symbolically. And as one final example of very magical concrete thinking, we have the shamanic shape-shifting. During the practice of shape-shifting, the shaman believes that he is actually taking on the physical form of one of his power animals. And in that form, he's able to do things that can help the tribe in some way. And so along with this irrational, magical, concrete thinking, which fuses the inner world and the outer world, for the tribal level there is also a fusion between my inner being and your inner being, or the inner being of the rest of the tribe. As a result, tribal living is a highly structured society with very little, if any, individuality. It's as if the individual in the tribe has no idea who they are outside of what the tribe tells them. So just to sum up so far, I think I've made a pretty strong argument for why the tribal level of consciousness is where we start on this journey called life. Tribal consciousness is fearful, irrational, magical. It's marked by concrete concepts, never symbolic. It has no sense of individuality, and as a result it can be very violent, and it's also pre-literate. And in these ways, the consciousness of tribal society is not a whole lot different than the consciousness of a small child. However, even though it does represent a lower level of consciousness, there are some valuable aspects to tribal consciousness that we've lost in our development that we need to get back in order to move forward as a human species. And this is especially true if you're looking to heal your bipolar disorder, because in my opinion, the best approach towards healing is much more along the shamanic path than it is along the path of either mainstream psychiatry or even mainstream psychology. And so it's on the valuable gifts of the tribal level of consciousness that I'm going to be focusing in part 2 of this video, which you can click on right here. In the first part of this video, I really focused on how the tribal level of consciousness is where we get started in this journey called life. And to prove my point, I gave a number of examples of how tribal people think that I think most of us are glad we've outgrown. However, even though the tribal level represents a lower level of consciousness, at this point in our history, being a modern society, there are also a number of characteristics of tribal life that we can learn from today. However, as I'll show in this video, what we want to do when we learn from tribal peoples is not go back in time to the way they used to live. Nobody wants that. But rather what we want to do is take what was great about these cultures and integrate them into our way of living so that we can grow. And in my opinion, above all else, what we truly need to understand from tribal culture is that spirit is truly everywhere. As tribal people believed, every moment of our lives is a spiritual experience, and every choice we make or action we take has a spiritual dimension and spiritual consequences. But how many of us are actually thinking of the spiritual dimension of life, for example, when we're at work, lying to our clients, or hiding losses? I wonder what the spiritual implications are going to be in families where the parents don't spend any time with their kids. 27 million Americans, that's 1 in 10, are currently on antidepressants, and that doesn't include all the people on illegal drugs. To me, this is just a sign that on a spirit level, people in today's world are really suffering. And for the most part, they're trying to relieve their suffering in entirely the wrong way, often through addiction. So while it's true that our modern world has brought us many technological wonders and a great degree of individual freedom, our overdependence on purely rational materialist thinking has led our culture into a type of wasteland, or as Ken Wilber calls it, the flatland, a purely rational and meaningless world, which feels flat because it has no depth to it. And it's right at this point in our desperate thirst for meaning in life that we can start to look to the tribal cultures for inspiration. Now, this doesn't mean that we need to follow a strict series of superstitious beliefs in order to keep from being punished by the spirits. No, this time around, rather than trying to please the spirits out there, we're trying to follow and satisfy our own inner spirit. You see, at every level of consciousness, the intuition of our inner spirit is communicating to us from the other side. However, as the rational mind develops, it starts to block out the other side, treating it as if it doesn't exist. And in doing so, the rational mind does its job of blocking out the irrational beliefs that are not helpful, but it also blocks out the irrational intuition that can help us guide our lives. Now, the reason I call it irrational is because it's actually superior to rational thought. The rational mind will always lead you to the safe, comfortable, predictable, and logical solution that everyone would expect. But the irrational, intuitive voice of your inner spirit will lead you to make the life choices that make you feel alive, giving life the meaning you're looking for. Now, in the same way that our education system helps us to develop our rational mind, getting in touch with your inner spirit takes a little bit of work as well. But this time, it's your shamanic skills that need developing. And this is especially true if you've got bipolar disorder, because there's nothing like a manic episode or a depression to let you know that your inner spirit is unhappy with how you're living your life. And so now I'd like to give you a few tips on how to develop the shamanic side of yourself. So the first thing you might want to do is start paying more attention to your dreams. As I mentioned earlier, the other side, our dream world, was considered as real to tribal people as this world is to us. However, for the most part in our modern world, we're taught to ignore our dreams. Now, while I'll be the first to admit that sometimes our dreams just seem like total nonsense, if you pay a little bit more attention, you can see that some dreams that you have may be deeply meaningful for your life and help to point you in the right direction. It was a single dream that inspired me to go to Peru, where I met my wife, and then more dreams that inspired me to leave my country of Canada to move to her country of Brazil. Now, sometimes the message of the dream might be obvious. For example, if you have a dream that you're killing your boss, it might be a sign that it's time to quit your job. At other points, the meanings of the dreams may seem more mysterious and symbolic, like the recurring dream I used to have that I was being chased by a tiger. Eventually, I figured out that this tiger represented my inner spirit and that I was ignoring it. That's why the tiger was chasing me. And looking back, I can honestly say that it has been in following my inner spirit and ignoring my rational mind that I've made some of the most important and interesting choices of my entire life. Now, if you're interested in taking a deeper look at your dreams, I also highly recommend meditating, especially before you go to bed. A short meditation of just 15 or 20 minutes can help to make your dream world more vivid, meaningful, and alive. And as you get more practice, you might even want to try lucid dreaming, where you're able to become conscious in your own dream, controlling the elements in the dream while you're there. And one other aspect of our dream world that few people realize is that this dream world stays with us while we're awake. And even though the rational mind is dominating our daily life and we're obsessed with the sensory world around us, all we need to do is close our eyes and we'll find that our dream world is there and it will respond to us. And in fact, many therapists and shamanic healers today take advantage of this ability of ours in visualization exercises, where we consciously interact with the materials of our dream world while we're still awake. Now, the next lesson from tribal shamans all around the world isn't one that modern people like to remember too often. In fact, they like to avoid this lesson at all costs. And that lesson is the value of suffering. Let's face it, it's a tough world out there, and it's always been a tough world. And in fact, the world has never been tougher than when you're living in tribal society. But what these people understood was that it was in overcoming their suffering and enduring their pain that they actually grew in strength and even purified their souls. And as a result, many of the rituals performed by tribes around the world are often extremely painful. Take that sun-moon dance I was talking about in the first video. Now, like I said before, 3 days, no food, no water. It's not an easy ritual to go through. But having done this dance 4 times, I can tell you that it's precisely because of the intensity of the suffering that it's the most powerful ritual that I've ever been a part of. Now, does this mean that I'm recommending that everybody go out and starve themselves to death, tattoo your face, and stick pins through your chest? No. But I am hoping that the kind of courage tribal people show when they go into their rituals will inspire you to face the pain and suffering of your daily life. Because what you're going through in your daily reality is just as important on a spiritual level as what you would endure in any tribal ritual, and often takes just as much courage. Now, if you're bipolar, it's going to be this last lesson that's really the most important, but as you'll see, it really incorporates the teachings from the other lessons as well. And that lesson is that when it comes to healing your bipolar disorder, you need to learn how to swim. You see, it's been well documented that many shamans become shamans after experiences of being plunged into the other side, or what psychiatry would call an acute psychosis. But of course, the big difference is that while the psychosis is blocked by psychiatry, the shaman learns to swim there. That's where he gets his power. And just like the shaman, when we have bipolar disorder and these experiences basically take us over, rather than running from them and blocking them like modern society wants us to do, we need to start embracing and engaging these experiences, just as if we're swimming on the other side, just like a shaman. So just to give an example, when you're in a psychosis, you might feel like you're a bear or you want to act like a bear and you don't even know why. Well, according to psychiatry, you would block that experience with medication. But following the shamanic path, you're going to want to let that bear come out. You're going to want to let yourself roar or even just move around the house like a bear, provided that you're not hurting yourself or anyone else. And this is how we heal the disorder. We get in touch with those feelings or energies that are coming from the other side, and we want to be them. We want to express them in the way that they want to be expressed. So whether you feel like a warrior from a past life or a baby being born again, if you feel like you're traveling through space or you've become the reincarnation of Jesus Christ, you need to be able to express these things in order to sort of move through the process. However, as opposed to the tribal shaman who is going to see the world from his magical perspective, interpreting these experiences in concrete, literal terms, eventually, when you heal your bipolar disorder, you need to be able to look back on your experiences and see them as spiritually meaningful, emotionally meaningful, and deeply symbolic, but not as the physical, literal experience that you seem to be having at the time. It's the difference between knowing that you accessed your bear energy and thinking that you were an actual physical bear. Or perhaps more importantly, it's the difference between knowing that you had accessed your Christ consciousness and thinking that you are still Jesus Christ, the Messiah here to save the earth. And in this way, it could very well be your ability to interpret your experiences symbolically and not concretely that could make the difference between you healing from your bipolar disorder and being stuck in a mental hospital. So if you're looking to evolve out of your bipolar disorder, I highly recommend taking a closer look at shamanism, because at the end of the day, the only person that's going to be able to heal you is the shaman that lies within. Your own inner healing shaman. According to psychiatry, one of the strongest signs that you've got bipolar disorder is when you start having delusions. And for them, any delusion is caused by a chemical imbalance, which will most likely need medication for your entire life. However, when you take a close look at the type of delusions that people have, many of them, which are very, very common among bipolar people, are often very spiritual in nature. Now, I've already introduced a few of these so-called delusions in the video Is Bipolar Mania Spiritual Enlightenment? So what I wanted to do in this video was just let you in on what I think are the roots of some of these delusions and why they're so common. And as you'll see, in my opinion, most of the so-called delusions are hardly the random connections of a broken brain, but come out of the complex relationship between your soul and your ego. Probably the most common delusion for people entering into psychosis for the very first time is to think that they are either dead or dying. And they should, because in a very real way, they are. You see, as I mentioned in the first video in this series, The Real Cause of Bipolar Disorder, the cause of an acute psychosis will always be the collapse of your ego, or false self. But what I didn't talk about is simply what it feels like when this false self or ego collapse occurs. First, you feel totally different, completely unlike the self you have come to know your entire life. And a part of that self has been your false self, which is made up of all the thoughts and ideas that you have known yourself to be. That's the ego part of you. So then during the ego collapse, when all of this false self just seems to leave you on what I can best describe as an energetic level, you feel so unlike you've ever felt that it's easy to assume, as I did, that you're in fact dead or dying. And in a way, a part of you is. If your psychosis completes itself in a healthy way, much of your false self or ego will die, and what you'll be left with is a feeling that you are much lighter and less boxed in than you were before. After thinking that you're dead or dying, thinking that you're Jesus or some type of Messiah is probably the second most common delusion. Now, why would so many people think that? Well, don't forget that when the ego or false self collapses, what you're left with is your true self or soul. You see, when our ego is in control of things, we have this inner feeling that somehow we're not good enough, that somehow we need to better ourselves in order to justify our existence. And to do that, we need to be something that we're not. And this is the ambition of the ego, our false self, to build ourself up in almost like an artificial way. Then, when that ego drops, how do we feel? We feel perfect, limitless, sacred. So in a sense, we're actually trading one delusion, the delusion of the ego that actually we suck, for something that's quite the opposite. And so engulfed in this feeling of perfection and sacredness, and without the rational egoic mind there to tell us otherwise, it's very easy to jump to the conclusion that we have become Jesus, our culture's strongest symbol of sacredness and perfection. And now it's true not everybody thinks of themselves as Jesus. People from other religious traditions or cultural backgrounds often identify with another religious figure. For example, people of the Islamic tradition might identify with Muhammad or see themselves as another prophet. But this idea of being the Messiah is by far the strongest image. And for women, if they don't see themselves as the Messiah or Jesus, they'll see themselves as actually giving birth to the Messiah, being the mother of Jesus or the Messiah. The third delusion is that we're somehow all-knowing. One sensation that most of us have in our everyday reality is that we never quite seem to know enough. Have you ever noticed that? It's as if no matter what we do, we just can't figure life out without more information. However, once again, when that ego collapses, we're left with this emotional intuition of the soul, which is telling us that everything is as it should be. And in that moment, there's the sensation of completeness. And with that completeness comes this sense of a perfect knowledge, a sense that you know everything there is to know, and yet somehow you can't explain it in words. It's as if you're having one giant nuclear aha moment. And so, considering that you feel that you're a sacred Messiah and have this perfect all-knowing information, what's to do? Save the world, of course. At this point, many people seem to become obsessed with certain social issues like homelessness, poverty, the greenhouse effect, this sort of thing. And then others, including Dr. David Lukoff, felt the compulsion to write their own religious text. The Jim Carrey movie The Truman Show is probably the most common reference that I've heard when asking people what psychosis is like. And this really shouldn't come as a surprise, because once the ego collapses, not only do our senses become more alive, but we also become more sensitive to other people, better able to read how they're feeling. And among the first things that you'll notice while you're in psychosis about the so-called normal people around you is that to some extent, pretty much everybody is acting, meaning that they're all hiding their true emotions, trying their best to fit into the role that they've sought out in society. And so seeing the world in this way, it's very easy to start to believe that you're in a movie, especially one like The Truman Show, where everybody is obviously fake and acting. And yet for many people at the same time, there's also the sensation that everything is just perfect, just the way it is. The psychiatrist, the hospital. Many people in mania head for the psychiatric hospital willingly, thinking, I'll be perfectly fine. It's all part of God's plan, and everything is happening and unfolding as it's meant to happen. And in this way, the sense of being in a movie is not a whole lot different than what was written about life thousands of years ago in the ancient Hindu scripts of India, the Vedas, where it is written that life is a divine play. Number 6 is seeing people as angels or demons. Now, even though the experience can be very sacred, it can also be very confusing, and often we're not sure of what to do next, and we're very often looking for help. But when we start looking for help, we're not looking for the person in charge or the name tag of somebody. No, we're looking for people who are going to love us. And to figure that out, we're going to look a person straight in the eyes. And if their face is open and we see love in those eyes, then we will see an angel before us. However, if that person looks at us judgmentally, analyzing, trying to control and manipulating us, invalidating this sacred experience, then we see a demon and we want nothing to do with them. To me, the most remarkable delusion people have is the sense that they're being tested by God. And with everybody, the test is remarkably the same. Are you going to continue to live on this material plane of reality, or are you going to choose a higher spiritual dimension of existence? And in that choice, maybe you're just saving yourself, but in some situations, some people feel that in making that decision, they're saving their family or even the entire planet. And in making that choice, in order to choose the higher dimension, it will feel like a form of ritualized suicide to the person, but not really in the sense of wanting to end your life and end the pain of existence, but rather in sacrificing your life for the greater good, much like Jesus allowed himself to be crucified rather than trying to escape. Now, some of these attempts appear quite subtle to the point of being absurd, but others can be quite dangerous, which reemphasizes my point that if you're going to try and go through a psychosis, that two people should be supporting and protecting you at all times. For me, it was simply switching off a hotel light switch, which was going to bring my personal annihilation. For my niece, it meant trying to jump through our apartment window. And then there was one guy I know who tried to take everybody on the airplane that he was flying in into the higher spiritual dimension by flushing the toilet in the airplane bathroom. And as crazy as these actions sound, not one of us is medicated today. So looked at this way, is it any wonder that life begins to look like a dream? Is it any wonder that we start to test reality? Because when we're in an acute psychosis, we are Alice, and we have gone way down the rabbit hole. So to sum up, rather than being caused by the chemical imbalance of a malfunctioning brain, all of these so-called delusions represent your reality from your non-ordinary state of consciousness, and in that sense, they're not delusions at all. In fact, I see them as the birth of something quite profound, the awakening of our Christ consciousness. And as with any birth, this process can be quite messy and difficult as well. Once the ego comes back online, some people are quite frightened and terrified of what just happened to them. Others feel even more alienated in this world and have a deep desire to go back to the other side. And then others are simply unable to let go of the experience, having what's normally called delusions of grandeur. Here, people don't remember their experience symbolically as the awakening to their own Christ consciousness. No, with delusions of grandeur, people see their experience concretely, that they are the Christ and superior to all others. However, it's my belief that, again, with loving support and a little guidance, people with these delusions can gradually understand that the true power of the awakening of their Christ consciousness comes when you're able to recognize the Christ consciousness in others and truly connect with other people in a more open and loving way. And when that happens, the spiritual evolution of someone with bipolar disorder becomes the spiritual evolution of all of us. And special thanks to my friends at newlightbeings.com for sharing their stories with me so that I could put this video together.